The most intense part of this story happens after you think things could not get any scarier towards the second half of the video. Sheck and Jim are two friends that had something happen to them that they never thought would be possible. Today, I'm going to go over the detailed account of Sheck and Jim, who entered the most dangerous sinkhole in America. Let's start the story. Sheck Exley is an American cave diver and mathematics teacher from Live Oak, Florida. He began diving in 1965 at the age of 16. The same year, he entered his first cave and was hooked on diving for the rest of his life. During his career, he established many of the basic safety procedures used in cave and overhead diving today. Exley is a legend and pioneer of extreme scuba diving. He would push the limits of dive sites to explore the unseen parts. Deep down, he was a fanatic for diving, and in particular, cave diving. He broke diving world records his entire life. Exley was the first in the world to log over 100 cave dives at the age of 23. In 29 years of cave diving, he made over 4,000 dives. Exley has an unusual resistance to nitrogen narcosis and was one of the few divers to survive a 400-foot or 120-meter open water dive on simple compressed air. Exley was the first person in the history of technical scuba diving to dive below 800 feet or 240 meters, a feat only 20 people have performed as of 2021. He helped standardize the usage of the octopus. The octopus is now considered an essential piece of equipment among virtually all scuba divers, whether caving or in open water. When Sheck and his friend Jim Bowden found the Zacaton sinkhole in the state of Tamaulipas, Mexico, they quickly realized it was the ultimate deep system. They didn't even have to say a word to each other and both understood that they would do everything to prepare to dive the sinkhole as soon as they could. A sinkhole is also called a cenote. The term cenote is a Spanish rendering of the Mayan word zonot, a hole in the ground. Sheck's friend Jim is a 54-year-old Texan who has devoted much of his life to exploring underwater caves throughout Central America and Mexico. Caves are his love and his life, and just about every penny he earns is poured into them. Anything left over at the end of the month, he uses to take care of the mundane things, like his mortgage and electric bill. No technical diver, however, not even Sheck, has reached the depths of the Zacaton, where hydrostatic pressure hits 487 pounds per square inch. Pressure this great can implode even the best diving equipment as easily as it could crush a styrofoam cup. Its effects on the body can be just as dramatic, making the range of psychological barriers read like an inventory of hypobaric nightmares. Barotrauma, aka the bends, oxygen toxicity, and high-pressure nervous syndrome. Any of these can result from breathing air or other gases under extreme pressure. Barotrauma often refers to the medical problems that arise from the effects of water pressure when a scuba diver is beneath the surface. Water is heavier than air, so when you dive, small changes in depth cause large changes in pressure underwater. If things are really bad, air embolism can occur. This is the most serious and most feared consequence of diving. While you are diving, gas bubbles can enter your circulatory system through the small ruptured veins in your lungs. These bubbles expand during the ascent and can pass through your heart to obstruct blood flow in the arteries of your brain or heart. Oxygen toxicity is a condition resulting from the harmful effects of breathing molecular oxygen at increased partial pressures. Severe cases can result in cell damage and death, with effects most often seen in the central nervous system, lungs, and eyes. High-pressure nervous syndrome describes the effect caused by rapidly increasing barometric pressure. Symptoms comprise dizziness, shivering, tremors, vertigo, nausea, and vomiting. The probability of experiencing HPNS, or high-pressure nervous syndrome, occurs when diving deeper than 120 meters. These are all severe life-threatening conditions, and this is important to remember for later in the story. To combat these dangers, Sheck and Jim have spent the last year going over every detail of their dive, attempting to make it, if not safe, at least survivable. Zacaton is the deepest of 5 cenotes located on a large ranch in El Rancho Asfrosa in northeastern Mexico. It is about 1,000 feet or 335 meters across, roughly circular, and contains a deep lake. The water is warm, about 86 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees Celsius. highly mineralized and has a sulfurous odor. The name El Zacaton comes from the floating islands of grass, which blow across the lake from one side of the other with wind. The sinkhole's depth has attracted serious divers for many years. In 2007, a multi-million-dollar exploration, mainly funded by NASA, was conducted to map out this sinkhole. Sheck and Jim's dive plan is fairly straightforward. Each diver will drop down to a near vertical cave under the weight of 200 pounds of gear, maintaining visual contact with the weighted line anchored to the bottom. At these depths, the inert gases in their breathing mixture will be rapidly absorbed into their bloodstreams. Water pressure will keep those gases compressed in the form of small, harmless bubbles, that is, until the divers return to the surface. If they ascend too quickly, the decreasing water pressure will cause the gases to bubble up and out of the solution like a can of soda shaken before being opened. The result is the bends, an excruciatingly painful, often fatal condition. To avoid this, Sheck and Jim, after touching the bottom, will rise to the surface slowly, making decompression stops at predetermined depths for specific periods of time. This will allow the gases to be released gradually. The entire process will keep them underwater for more than 10 hours. The key is a speedy descent. The faster they reach the bottom and then start back up again, the less gas is absorbed. To that end, they'll drop at a rate of 100 feet or 30 meters per minute. To put this into perspective, a commercial diver descending at 1,000 plus feet would breathe through a surface supplied hose and take upward of 24 hours to reach his destination. Sheck and Jim will be there in 12 minutes. Another problem is air supply, because divers can't carry 10 hours worth of air on their backs. Dozens of air tanks called stage air, each holding a different mixture designed to speed compression, are tied onto the descent lines at various decompression stops. Even with these extra tanks, however, if the diver takes more than 6 breaths per minute at any point during the descent, he'll run out of gas long before making it back to the surface. The goal of this upcoming dive was thus declared, that within a calendar year, a dive to obtain the bottom of the Zacaton would be made by Jim and Sheck. Before diving the Zacaton, Sheck and Jim needed to do extensive preparations for such a dangerous dive. In preparation, Sheck decided to dive a huge underwater cave at Bushman's Hole in South Africa, diving to 863 feet or 260 meters in this system. He used a decompression schedule developed with his own software to dive Bushman's. Squeezing through a 3-foot crack to enter it, he picked up the speed and descended 200 feet or 60 meters into the world's largest underwater cavern. Even to Sheck, its size was overwhelming. However, during this dive, Sheck experienced visual, stomatic, and neurological symptoms of high-pressure nervous syndrome. The time between December and April had passed rapidly, with preparations and planning consuming day and night. Both Jim and Sheck made multiple deep air acclimation dives to prepare themselves. In addition to 3 sub 500 or 152 meter dives, Jim made over 30 dives in excess of 300 feet or 100 meters. Many of these dives included skills testing at depth, primarily problem-solving questions or tasks posed by a colleague on a dive slate while on air. It is essential that he is comfortable with an equivalent narcosis depth of 300 feet or about 100 meters. The bottom of the sinkhole would demand a lot more. He made one more dive to 314 feet on air, or just over 110 meters, a record on air in a cave, but it was soon eclipsed by Sheck by his dive to 420 feet or 130 meters on April 4th, 2 days before their attempts to the bottom. Sheck was very competitive with his friend Jim and would usually try to beat his records. They had tremendous respect for each other, but secretly, they were always competing. It was finally getting time to dive the Zacaton. Early in the morning on Wednesday, April 6, 1994, everybody was ready to go, and the divers with their support team assembled on the banks of the El Nacimiento River, which was connected to Zacaton. The pre-dive mood was positive and optimistic. This dive was a huge deal, and many people came out to support both Sheck and Jim. Mary Ellen Eckhoff, Sheck's ex-wife, Karen Hull, Jim's wife, and Ann Kristovich, an accomplished diver in her own right, and Marcos Gary were all in attendance. Press representatives included a writer and photographer from Sports Illustrated, a photographer from Destination Discovery, and a television film crew. Also in attendance was the landowner and his family, along with a lot of local residents of the area. The weather was perfect for the dive that day, and it was beautiful in this scenic location in Mexico. The stark beauty of Zacaton's cliffs, sun-baked and barren, is breathtaking, but the diver's true interest lies at the bottom. Sheck and Jim put on all of their equipment, wished each other luck, and entered the water. In order to get into the sinkhole, you had to swim down the Nacimiento River. The river is formed by the spring run emanating from the Zacaton. A boil, which is usually caused by a fault line of hot springs, was noted on the water's surface near a limestone outcropping. Working against the river's current, the divers located a small cave and followed a northeast azimuth until they had used up their entire dive line. The dive would be accomplished on independent dive descent lines, a condition both divers favored to avoid contact with potential interference during the very rapid descent. Each of their dives would be solo by necessity. The maximum depth of this dive was unknown. They started a new dive line and swam through the 600-foot passage to the sinkhole. The late morning sun was cresting over the ridge surrounding the Zacaton as Sheck and Jim completed their equipment check. They're finally ready. They give each other one last nod and separate at this time to follow their respective descent lines, heading down through some mineralized sulfur clouds held in suspension through warm water growing even darker. Flashlights now cut through the darkness. Time passed in silence as they calmed their breathing and focused their minds on what was ahead. Any small mistakes while on this dive could cause serious problems and most likely death. After some time descending, Jim glanced over at Sheck. He seemed to sense Jim's glance and nodded affirmation. Jim then submerged and hesitated at 10 feet, or about 3 meters, for a minute or so, and then went into a free fall. He had planned a descent rate of 100 feet per minute to 300 feet on air, then the same rate to 600 feet. Jim planned to slow his descent around 750 feet to 800 feet, or 243 meters. At this depth, this is where he previously had high pressure nervous syndrome, or HPNS. Jim knew that if he got this syndrome on this particular dive, it would almost be a death sentence. So far, everything is going to plan. As he passed the 800-foot mark, or 240 meters, he noticed a light flashing in front of him. He could see Sheck's light in the distance. Meanwhile, Sheck continued down, at a rate faster than even before. At 700 feet, or 210 meters, however, his body started going into fits. Hundreds of small concentric circles, each with a sparkling dot at its center, filled his vision. His body began itching and stinging. It was high-pressure nervous syndrome, a little understood phenomenon brought on by the severe rapid compression. The extreme pressure inhibits the function of the brain, causing the neural circuits to run wild. He hovered at about 750 feet, or 220 meters, to consider his options. Abort or continue down? He had to decide. His life depended on it. He started down again, more slowly this time, though there was little physical change. By the time the cave bottomed out at 860 feet, or 250 meters, Sheck's entire body had begun shaking uncontrollably. Sheck ignored it. He wanted to fight through this. His flashlight cut through the darkness. Even without full vision, he could make out what appeared to be a lunar landscape, a uniformly flat bottom, sloping away from him, covered with small rocks, and buried in nearly a foot of black sediment. No one had ever been or stood where he was standing. He couldn't stay down there long, since every minute of extra time he spent at that depth would eventually have to be paid for with extra hours of decompression. After he looked around his surroundings, he inflated his buoyancy control device and began to rise. He was more than halfway to the surface before the syndrome subsided. Meanwhile, Jim was at 900 feet, 274 meters, and he was shocked to find that he had breathed far more air than he had planned. At this depth, his regulators could easily fail. This was a big problem, and Jim had to deal with it quickly. He inflated his buoyancy control device and managed to stop his descent at 920 feet, or 280 meters. He then switched from his main air tank to his backup at 450 feet, or 137 meters. By this time, both of his air tanks were empty. He had to grab the staged air that he left on his original descent. Stage air is left while descending for divers to use back on their ascent to the surface. To Jim's horror, when he turned on the new air tank, the regulator broke off from the valve violently. This was a major problem and caused him to panic, but somehow he was able to reattach it. This was a major problem. Every second felt like an eternity. If he didn't fix this, he would drown. He ended up having to switch back to a different air tank because he couldn't fix the regulator. The only solution was to open and close the valve with each breath. He had 8 minutes of stops between 350 feet or 100 meters and where the next stage bottle was. He could breathe easier when he made it to the staged air with a properly functioning regulator. Now would come the really long decompression and the worry about oxygen toxicity and barotrauma. Luckily for Jim, he is able to switch to another air tank at 250 feet or 80 meters. That's when he knew something was very wrong with Sheck. At 130 feet or 40 meters above him, the sun was set below the ridge surrounding the cave. He could clearly observe the line Sheck used on his descent. All of his stage bottles were still neatly packaged and unused. The sinking feeling in his heart was overcome by the confidence that Sheck had gone deeper and that he was probably still below Jim. Sheck was known to do this while diving, but Jim was still surprised he would dive that deep in such a dangerous sinkhole. On the surface, the support team already knew Sheck was in trouble, and Kristovich had watched the bubble paths of both men on the initial descent. Jim's bubbles disappeared at 2 minutes, and Sheck's vanished a few seconds later as they both reached the ledge at 250 feet or 75 meters. Only one set of bubbles reappeared after about 15 minutes, and she couldn't be sure if they were Jim's or Sheck's. And Kristovich exchanged uneasy glances with Jim's wife, Karen. As planned, she then dived to meet Jim at the 47-minute mark of his dive profile. She was relieved to find him, but chilled to see Sheck's stage equipment still hanging with no sign of him. The grim awareness of the situation gripped the pair. Meanwhile, Mary was watching from the cliffs with no knowledge of the problem. She joined Jim's wife at the surface and assessed the situation. Concerned, but not panicked by the situation, she grabbed an extra stage bottle to take to Sheck and swam down to encounter Jim and Anne. Now her worst fears were becoming reality. She hastily wrote on the dive slate that she is going to go to 250 feet or 75 meters to look for bubbles. Dropping over the deep ledge, she could find no sign of Sheck or any bubbles coming from the depths. Jim's wife had scrambled into her gear and caught up with Mary. She met Mary Ellen at about 150 feet or 30 meters on her way back up. She was crying and her mask was messed up. She wanted to go back to the surface, but Jim grabbed her gauge and saw that it read 278 feet or 85 meters. All he could do was hold her. They stayed down there for more than 30 minutes to get through the decompression. It was a very lonely time. Jim was finally told that Sheck was lost as he reached the 60-foot stop or 20 meters. He felt himself grow numb from the loss and describes the remainder of his decompression as a mechanical exercise, with little conscious thought. After a total of nearly 10 hours, he surfaced. It was a horrible moment for Jim. They knew the risks that they were taking, but still it was hard to imagine Sheck not surviving the dive. Jim was now the first diver to successfully break the 900-foot or 274-meter barrier on self-contained scuba air. His record depth of 925 feet or 280 meters eclipsed Sheck's old 881-foot mark or 270 meters. There is no consideration given to mounting a body recovery for Sheck, since it was accepted that the only man capable of such a recovery was the man who was already down there. 3 days later, while hoisting up the remainder of the equipment, Sheck's body was found. He had apparently drifted up from the deep cave passage and become entangled in line. One of his tanks still had gas and his computer read 904 feet or 274 meters, suggesting that whatever trouble he had did not occur until 9 minutes into the dive. The best educated guess would be to point to his high-pressure nervous syndrome incident. Sheck had experienced a bad one in Africa that resulted in uncontrollable muscle spasms and multiple vision. This may have manifested again with more violent tremors that could have triggered an oxygen convulsion or simply made it impossible to negotiate gas switches as necessary. Sheck's loss shocked and saddened the entire world community of diving explorers. To this day, he is considered one of the foremost leaders in cave diving and mixed gas diving techniques. He truly led the way for others that followed in his footsteps. If you're looking for scary stories to binge to, you have come to the right place, because I tell news stories multiple times a week about disastrous and chilling events. I want to say thank you for watching the video, and if you are new here and enjoy my content, I would greatly appreciate it if you could hit the subscribe button. As always, please be nice to the like button, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of Mr. Deified's weekly uploads. I'm excited to share more disaster stories with you. See you at the next one.